let a few people continue to join. Okay. I guess Hannah, you can let everyone in. Okay, well, it's nice to see everyone again, and I'm really excited for this week's presentation, and am honored to introduce my colleague and friend and scholar Zoé Samudzi, who is also the third co-organizer of this seminar series, the fourth seminar on security. So I'm going to give a little bio, and then I'll hand it over to Zoe. And we actually also have the privilege of Zoe's mom being in the room just behind Zoe, so you'll maybe periodically get a little view of her. Zoé Samudzi is a visiting assistant professor in genocide studies and genocide prevention at the Strassler Center at Clark University, and the co-author of the 2018 book As Black as Resistance, published by AK Press. I think Hannah will drop a link to that in the chat. Zoe is also an associate editor of Parapraxis, and has published several pieces in the magazine, which we'll also share in the chat, and is very, I think, has been extremely influential in the way we've conceived of security for the issue and for the seminar. And I've learned so much already from reading Zoe's pieces and thinking together, and I'm just very happy to have you. And yeah, we'll get started.
Thank you so much for the sweet introduction, Wendy. Super glad to be here to be doing today's seminar. It seems so like hyper secret and on the website where it just says TK. But based on the readings, you may have been able to deduce that we're thinking a lot today about the kind of psychopolitical elements of the security questions of and around Zionism, which could not be more kind of prescient and urgent considering the ongoing genocidal assault against Gaza, situated within, of course, the 76, nearly 80 preceding years of the displacement and the violence of the Nakba since the founding of the State of Israel. So I'm going to kind of be hopping in between some historical context and the readings and the present, to kind of weave together a kind of psychoanalytic, psychopolitical constellation of how to think about Zionism, the Israeli state, but then also these readings and the larger implications for genocide recognition and the kind of political constructions and understandings of victimhood. A comment that I think we've heard a lot in a lot of the kind of anti-Zionist or Palestine solidarity protesting in the moment is this idea of freeing Palestine from German guilt, that there's this kind of triangulation between Germany, Israel, and Palestine, that Palestine necessarily is being, or is a kind of collateral for Western guilt around the Nazi Holocaust. But I would actually like to propose a different kind of historical frame, a different kind of historical nexus of genocide. And I would like to propose this is a nexus actually between Germany, Namibia, and Israel, Palestine, bringing the Ovaherero and Nama genocide perpetrated by Germany at the beginning of the 20th century into this frame of how colonial genocide does not receive the same kind of genocide recognition. And so the kind of archetypal German genocide is constructed through and with regards to the Nazi Holocaust. So just briefly, Germany began its colonizing very late in 1884. It was granted its African colonies after the Berlin Conference of 84-85. It was given a couple of colonies in West Africa and what is now Togo. Was also given German East Africa in present-day Tanzania, and then was also given German Southwest Africa, which is present-day Namibia. It also had colonies in the Pacific and in China. But it is in what is now Germany, what is now Namibia, that the kind of historical consensus says that the first genocide of the 20th century was perpetrated against the indigenous inhabitants of Southwest Africa, specifically against the Ovaherero and Nama people, as well as the Damara people and San people, between about 1904 and 1908, which is when historical consensus recognizes this genocide. During the so-called Herero Wars, about 80% of the Ovaherero were killed and 50% of the Nama people were killed. In 1915, after Germany lost all of its colonies, after its defeat in World War I, after the passage of the Treaty of Versailles, what is now Namibia was annexed by the British, and eventually Namibia was governed as a part of apartheid South Africa as a kind of de facto external colony. So what's important about this kind of historical context is the way that the relationship between colonial genocide and the Nazi Holocaust that is only relatively recently being engaged in seriousness is articulated through what is understood as a continuity thesis. And this is, for me at least, a kind of reprehensible historical formulation in the way that it understands the genocide in Namibia as being a kind of practice run for the Nazi Holocaust. And in this way, kind of two things are articulated. One, the fact that anti-Black genocide is never understood as a kind of means unto itself, but rather in this case is understood as a kind of prelude to the big one, right? Almost this inevitably historically ordained genocide against Jews in Europe, which is only something that can be understood in retrospect, and yet it's something that's very much formulated as a part of this kind of transnational German imperial plan. And so there's something that's revealed in that, right? There's something that's revealed in this idea that the Holocaust was always inevitable, when in fact the final solution, this idea to engage in genocide against Jewish people was not something that really came about until the mid-ish to late 30s. And in fact, what falls out of that analysis is also the fact that the kind of settler politic in Eastern Europe was something that was framed very much in relation to the previous colonizing project. So rather than understanding, the genocide in Africa as a practice run to the genocide in Germany, in which we see a kind of preeminent production of a particular kind of victimhood, we have to understand Nazism as reinfleshing these racial imperial politics of Lebensraum, which was first materialized in Southwest Africa, and then kind of reinscribed in Eastern Europe and across Europe. And in fact, we can see this in the language of, for example, the Nazi officials in Ukraine, who constantly would describe Ukrainians as white Negroes and would constantly describe the annexation of Eastern European land in the same discursive and rhetorical frames of the colonial war that had preceded it. So I just want to start with this part, and we can talk a little bit more about this in the Q&A, because of how all of this whole frame of victimhood is kind of completely written out in order to exceptionalize the kind of victimhood that is produced by Nazi violence, rather than understanding Nazism in relation to other kinds of colonial brutality, as was kind of offered by M. Césaire in discourses on colonialism. And so what comes out of this kind of exceptional recognition of the Nazi Holocaust is also a kind of hierarchization of genocide victimhood. What we can understand, really the sin of Germany was not the fact that Germany committed a genocide, because of course, the only kind of contestations or challenges to Germany's genocidal practice in Africa was, England's justification that that kind of colonial governance was sufficient to get Germany, or to kind of get Germany's African colonies taken away. But that really was just a kind of economic and political argument. In fact, what comes out of, or what the real objection to what the Nazis did, was the fact that Germany committed the ultimate sin of utilizing genocidal technologies, not against Europeans, because of course we know that Jews, Roma, Sinti, queers, communists, and so on weren't fully included within this frame of European citizenship, but rather these genocidal technologies were being used in Europe, that these were technologies that were to be otherwise reserved for colonial subjects and in the colonies. And so additionally, part of the way that Holocaust exceptionalism is upheld is this real refusal to understand the kind of racial production of Jewish identity as being a part of an imperial project of racial statecrafting, which is why, for example, we get these kinds of formulations of racism and anti-Semitism, right? Where anti-Semitism kind of exists as a kind of racial production or othering that happened in a vacuum outside of the racializations that occurred in the process of Christian imperialism and the formation of the European color line. So I think what these two pieces that we read for today kind of bring into frame is a kind of metastasization of victimhood and history by and through the Westphalian state, particularly in the creation of a Jewish state in Israel. And I want us to kind of do away with all of these ideas and all of these insistences that there is not a synonymity between Jews and the state of Israel, when in fact there was a very deliberate collapsing of Jewish and Israeli identity in and through and by the Zionist, both national project in Israel and the kind of transnational Zionist support for the state of Israel. And so I think something that becomes interesting that we'll kind of get into in some more detail throughout this conversation is the really kind of troubled and exploitative relationship between the legacy of victimization in the Holocaust and the kind of new Jewish identity that is produced by the Israeli state. What we see actually, despite the fact that the Holocaust is very much a kind of centerpiece of Jewish Israeli identity, is the fact that the Holocaust is actually deeply marginalized in Israeli society. If we look at the kind of statistics, for example, of survivors and Holocaust survivors who live in Israel, who are supposed to be getting all kinds of subsidies and all kinds of government support, we actually see a pretty large proportion of Holocaust survivors actually living in poverty and well below the poverty line, and not actually receiving any of the kind of benefits that they're supposed to be receiving from the state, despite that suffering being used as a kind of primary justification for the displacement of and all of this violence against Palestinians. And so, we see often in kind of new or Israeli discourse right after the Holocaust, you see a tremendous amount actually of descriptions of Eastern European Jews as kind of weak and impotent, unable to defend themselves. Lambs to a slaughter, right, is the second part of this, the phraseology of never again, like lambs to a slaughter, as a kind of clarion call for Zionist fortressing and Zionist muscular Jewish strengthening. And it is the muscular Jew in Israel that arises out of the creation of the Jewish state that is supposed to be a kind of foil to the impotence of the diasporan, but in fact is only able to exist through an altogether negation of diaspora subjectivity. And we'll get to that momentarily when we talk about the central tenet of Zionism as the negation of the diaspora itself. So I kind of want to hold two things. So first, I kind of want to think through the Benbassa chapter in Suffering as Identity, and she begins. She writes, if when suffering and pain are transformed into spectacle, they are diverted. It is to be feared that once they disappear, a veil will be cast over the real importance of the event, that profound rupture of the human that is perhaps the only real lesson that genocide has to teach. So there's this particular way, and in the way that we're talking about security, that security ultimately operates as a preservation of genocide memory. Never again coalesces into a kind of fascistic state fortressing under the guise of, a Jewish subject that is kind of constantly under existential threat. I mean, she quotes, and there are, scores and scores of quotes to this effect. Begin, who was prime minister from '77, talking about Israel as the heir of the Holocaust victim, or after the '67 war, which saw the expansion of the Israeli state through the annexation of neighboring Arab states. Abba Eban, who was a member of the Labour Party, describing the previous borders vis-a-vis this new expansion as the Auschwitz frontiers. So here you have, in these repeated articulations by these early leaders, and then in a number of new ways by present day Israeli leadership, this idea that genocide thus becomes a legitimation of the occupation of these nearby Arab lands, and as this ongoing settler violence or occupation or whatever kind of military campaign against the Palestinian people. And in the kind of early days of the Israeli state, you have an articulation of genocide, of the Shoah, in theological terms, she writes. She says there's this ideologization of the Holocaust that now goes hand in hand with its sacralization and with the reinforcement of teleological interpretations, which is to say that there are again all of these justifications of Israeli policy vis-a-vis Palestine that also then affects this self-perception of Jews in and of the diaspora. There's this way that then the history of the Jews, so we're going to capitalize both letters because this is no longer about a kind of multiplicity of Jewish existence, and rather a homogenization of Jewish existence through this singular genocidal moment, that, the history of Jews ceases to be universal history. And there is this kind of national, as nation state transformation of, quote, an extensively Judaized memory of the genocide, which gains an upper hand. And in this context, we see the Holocaust emerging also as its own kind of both Hebrew non-secular and secular religion within this structuring of memory. And there becomes, even as I said at the very beginning, that there was actually a kind of deep antagonism of genocide, of Holocaust survivors in the very early days of the Israeli state. She talks about the ways that actually the memory of this genocide really serves as a unifier, an intergenerational unifier of Israeli state society. She says, yesterday's victors feel that they've become today's victims, whereas yesterday's victims have become today's victors. And I think there are kind of two important rebuttals to the kind of centralization of this kind of singular memory politic of a new Jewishness after World War II. She first quotes Yehuda Elkanah in 1988, saying that, the Israeli relation to Palestinians is mediated by, quote, a profound existential fear sustained by one particular interpretation of genocide, according to which the world is against the Jews and Jews are eternal victims. And so in the foregrounding of Shoah memory as this particular orientation for Westphalian identity, what we see is the creation of a fundamentally undemocratic security practice per Elkanah that, Elkanah, in response to this, issues a call to forget in a particular way. Of course, not to forget this history of loss, this history of violence. That would be a kind of, a damaging myopia for everyone. But to let go of a kind of centralization of a memory politic, because you cannot shape a present or future solely on this relation to a past. And in this way, they open incredibly important questions about the formation of memory politics as a nation, as a diaspora, or as a nation state. And you also have, this quote by Moshe Zuckerman, where he says, Israel has repressed the Holocaust while utilizing its image as a concrete illustration of the right to the right of the Zionist state to exist and develop. And I think that, a really important illustration of this is, and I talk about this a little bit. Oh, I feel awkward saying this. I recently wrote a paper called "We Are Fighting Nazis" that is specifically about the formulation of Palestinians as Nazis by the Israeli state. And, at the beginning of the paper, I start by kind of the moment in the United Nations in which the Israeli ambassador stands up wearing the Judenstern, the yellow star that Jews have been forced to wear in Europe for centuries, even prior to the Holocaust, and was talking about how, in memory of my grandparents, we will wear this star every day in the United Nations until the Security Council passes some kind of sanction and recognizes this genocidal attack against Israelis that occurred on October 7th. And there was a really interesting kind of negotiation between this expression of a kind of persistent, eternal victimhood, when the chairman of Yad Vashem vehemently disagreed and disapproved of and kind of condemned this action, saying, we don't need to affix a yellow star to our lapels anymore because now we have a blue and white flag. So even in this present, see this kind of national memoriological contention between Holocaust victimhood and the muscular Israeli whose fortressing is now able to push back against these new Nazi, these new existential threats that are manifesting as the new Nazi, because there is one singular kind of historical thread through which Israeli victimhood, through which Jewish victimhood can be understood, and that is exclusively through Nazism. And to this point, the neighboring Muslim Arab security threat is not almost exclusively, but very heavily cast through this their framing as the new Nazi. You have the kind of persistent denialist myth of Mufti Hussein, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, being the one who actually inspired Hitler to engage in genocide against Jews, when in fact, by the time that they had met in 1941, there had already been these summary executions and mass massacres against Jews, and Hitler had already begun the invasion of the Soviet Union. However, this is a meeting that in many people's minds, because the Mufti is positioning himself not only as a leader of Palestinians, but as Arabs and Muslims of the region more broadly, that his willingness to collaborate with the Nazis in order to prevent the immigration of Jews into the kind of allotted Jewish state, that this is illustration of his larger investment in the kind of global genocide of not only Europeans, but Jews around the world. So in addition to, Grand Mufti Hussein, you also have, as Benbassa wrote, Gamal Abdel Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal being understood in the same frame as Hitler's annexation of Austria in 1938. And so kind of casting Nasser as a kind of Hitler adjacent character with the forced departure of Jews as well from Egypt in 1956. And then there is, of course, the kind of long-standing casting of Yasser Arafat as Hitler, even doctoring an image of him in his kind of military uniform as, wearing an SS uniform with a Nazi armband. Um, and so I want to think about next the kind of tensions that exist between the um, the kind of multiplicity of diaspora Jewish response and memory of the Holocaust against this fundamental idea called shlilat hagalut, which is the negation of the diaspora, which is a central politic to Zionism, which basically denies any plausibility of Jewish freedom, Jewish life, emancipation, and so on in the diaspora, with and which then, argues that in order for Jews to be saved, they must either return to or emphatically support the creation of a Jewish state that must defend itself, protect itself by any means necessary. And it's also articulated as this idea that Jews have no future without Israel as its spiritual center, which, as we know, Jews were able to live life all over the world prior to the creation of the state of Israel. And so, even again, as I kind of noted, an interesting kind of disdain for Jewish victimhood survivorship of the Holocaust in the early days of the creation of the Israeli state. The Eichmann trial is what really introduces and really begins to centralize the Holocaust into Israeli consciousness and a kind of national identification with both victors or victims, excuse me, and survivors. Because what, Jews who participated in the trial were there to testify, they were there to testify, as Benbassa says, their impotent existence in the diaspora. Not only to testify the brutality of the Nazis, but the impossibility of Jewish existence and self-defense in the face of Nazi, but also necessarily all of the other genocidal existential threats that would inevitably follow this one and preceded this one. And so never again then becomes this memoriological and psycho-national mantra, never again like sheep to slaughter. Because we have this state, we are here on the lands of the state, on the soils of the state that is going to make Jewishness strong again. We are trying this man, and we are kind of stealing our national identity as people who withstood this violence and now in Israel will be able to withstand any other threat. This is the kind of process of identity that is forming around this trial. And this is about 6 years prior to the 67 war, which in the national consciousness is a tremendous victory, that Israel can not only hold its borders, the Jewish state can not only hold its borders, it can expand its borders, it can rebuff the threats presented to it by the new Nazis that constitute the neighboring Arab Muslim states. So in the, and I hope we know that I'm like very much ventriloquizing Zionism here, just to want to reiterate that. So with the Eichmann trial, what also becomes really important is the kind of ethnopolitical coalescence of Ashkenazi supremacy. That, there are many different ethnicities of Jews around the world, a number of different ethnicities also in Israel. But often when you talk about, when people talk about Israel, we talk about kind of 4 tiers of Jewish identity. We talk about Ashkenazim at the top, Sephardim in the middle, Mizrahim at the bottom, and then Beta Israel, Black Ethiopian Jews somewhere at the bottom. And here we really see, the Jewish people who comprise the identity or who are descendants of victims of the Holocaust, kind of rising to a particular kind of ethno-political dominance as being the kind of centerpiece of national identity. And in addition, there's a kind of intergenerational cementing of the bonds between young Israelis born in this new Jewish state and their grandparents, a collapsing of Holocaust memory into a context of a permanent state of war. So the memory of the Holocaust becomes inextricably linked to the practices of permanent security that are being enacted by this young Jewish state. And so the geopolitical maneuvers become representations of a kind of perpetual state of Jewish instability, which then kind of justifies the any means necessary treatment of Palestinians that we've seen arriving, all of the kind of necropolitics from, even in just the past 150, however many days we're at now, of the destruction of homes, the destruction of universities, of hospitals, the imprisonment of children, which is a longstanding Israeli practice, but then also in the destruction of hospitals, the death of infants, right? So the eradication of future generations. And in this particular sense, what's important and what's a kind of universal practice of genocide as a productive state-making logic is the purpose of permanent security, which was actually first articulated by a Nazi officer during the Nuremberg trials, is an attempt to not only destroy in the present, but always an attempt to destroy in the future. It's this attempt to kill in the context of the Shoah, to kill all Jews so they will not be able to amass or even imagine attempting to amass any kind of resistance in the future. And this is a kind of standard practice, for genocide, kind of around the world and throughout history. And so, against the fabricated hegemony and homogeneity of what is understood and intended to be a kind of singular Jewish identity through Israel, we have Amery as a diaspora Jew thinking about resentment and adopting an incredibly complicated position, a much more complicated position, in my opinion, than the kind of totalizing Zionist singularity, in thinking about what it means in living in Germany, or living, in fact, in across Europe, what it means to live in the same place as your oppressor, what it means to share a citizenship with your oppressor, and the inevitable, in my opinion, incredibly healthy resentment and the difficulty of the resentment and how to kind of work through it. And what I find to be really interesting in this kind of navigation of what he describes as this retrospective grudge is the way that he refuses the kind of easy polemic or the easy kind of polemical state, opting in fact for this kind of deep psychic interrogation and introspection of exactly what is animating this idea around resentment. So he's kind of thinking about resentment as sitting between, these two spaces, right? What does it mean to justify a psychic condition condemned by moralists and psychologists alike? To think about this interstitial space as a space between a taint, as it is described by the moralists, and a sickness, as described by the psychologists. And so I think, at least for me, there are kind of three main aspects to this politic, or this understanding of resentment as a kind of diaspora politic, a Jewish diasporic politic rather, but also a politic of genocide survivorship and recognition more broadly. And the first is, he talks about how resentments are this existential dominant of people like myself, and it is not a kind of thing that emerges in a moment, but it is rather the result of personal and historical development. There's this really, interesting moment where they're emerging out of the Holocaust, and Jews are being lauded as heroes, as survivors, enjoying an elevated social and moral status, as the victims of a regime that at this point is universally loathed. And so there's a kind of comfortable, as he's describing it, relation between the kind of German moral balance between collective crime and collective guilt. But as he kind of quickly comes to realize, this performance of kind of Westphalian atonement by the Germans is completely, it's all an illusion, right? There's nothing real about it in the slightest. And he talks about, and I think that this is a really critical kind of tension in the post-war and even present day German national psyche. He talks about an encounter with an anonymous letter directed to occupying forces by an individual who describes being inspired both by Goebbels, the Nazi propagandist, and by Eichendorff, who is a prominent or was a prominent German romanticist, poet, and critic. And so this kind of nationalistic sentiment of Germany's inevitable return to greatness, a Fourth Reich, if you will. And this puzzles Amery tremendously because he's like, you know, we were all led to believe that Germans in Germany were all remorseful. And so how and where out of this alleged sea of remorse does this kind of indignation arise? And, you know, this is a remorse that everyone pushed as a kind of obligation, but in fact, he's realizing that this remorse is very speedily diminishing with time. And I think that we have our own interpretations of actually what is the nature of collective German guilt, right? I don't think it has anything to do with any actual care for Jews, as we're seeing in this present moment, where the German state is punishing German Jews for their expression of anti-Zionism or for their expression of solidarity with Palestinians, which is to say that in Germany's kind of reconstitution, it understands a need to, in supporting Jews, to discipline a particular kind of Jewishness, a particular kind of assimilable Jewishness. You know, he talks also about the kind of unease that he has in Germany's kind of emergence as a power player, an industrial power, West Germany rather, and as a state that tries to overcome Nazi aberration, which is very different actually from remorse, and very different from any kind of apology, and in fact, very different from the ways that we've talked about repair and reparation. I won't pretend to be especially adept at Klein's work, but I do remember talking about the difference between a kind of manic reparation that simply recognizes a need to return to some state of normalcy rather than an actual deep reparation that seeks to repair harm, but on the kind of terms of the person harmed rather than the terms of the person who did the harming. And I'll wrap up quickly. You know, he talks about a kind of resentment that grows and that builds in seeing Germany's economic rise. Like, how are you apologetic? What does it mean for you to simultaneously be apologetic and then to jump both feet back into this race of a capitalistic accrual of power? And, you know, and he talks about how, you know, second, in seeing the success of the German state as kind of animating these senses of resentment, how resentment becomes a reason for one to distrust themselves because of this you know, being compelled by victims to internalize what they experienced. But he talks about how, you know, the concentration camp syndrome, the victims' personalities have been altogether distorted by harm and persecution, right? He's not abiding by this idea that there's this elevated sense of moral clarity that comes out of being victimized. He's like, I was put in a camp, I was beaten with a shovel. I don't know what you think I'm expected to be in coming out of this. Like, I'm indignant and I'm mad and I don't exactly know where it comes from, but I know that that sense of resentment is completely legitimate. But he talks about how, you know, resentment is to some extent unnatural, logically inconsistent, that it describes a kind of hostile withdrawal into oneself. And he talks about also a tension between the obligation to internalize with the actual self-effacing negation that that internalization completely demands. That, you know, you are being deprived of your desire to at least dream about some kind of compensation for suffering beyond the kind of financial reparation that West Germany did give. And then we can kind of put, you know, scare quotes and caveats across that. He talks about how, you know, the sufferer, the holder of resentment, ultimately is the one that is captive of the moral truth of the conflict. And I think, at least in my interpretation, this is where the legitimacy of resentment emerges from, right? The fact that, you know, he says that only when his SS brutalizer stands before the firing squad is that person able to actually experience the moral truth alongside the victims. So there's this weird impasse, and this is where I'll kind of end. There's something that needs to emerge somewhere between revenge and what he describes as problematic atonement, but he's not 100% sure what it is. It certainly can't be, again, the way that Abba Kavner said, you know, 6 million Germans for 6 million Jews, in the kind of plot that was created after World War II by some former members of the resistance to try to poison the water in the city of Nuremberg. But there has to be something. And so his resolution I find to be really kind of compelling, which is to permit resentment to remain alive in one camp, and by, you know, aroused by that resentment, mistrust in the other, rather than this refusal of everyone returning to this kind of performance of kind of citizenship normalcy that is impossible to kind of come by. And he says, you know, all recognizable signs suggest that natural time will reject the moral demands of our resentment and finally extinguish them, but that Germany will not make it good. And I will kind of end with that. I'm sorry this kind of took so long as a presentation, but yeah, I'll end there.
No, thank you. That was really helpful. And yeah, do also look at Zoe's piece in the repair issue, Parapraxis. So if anyone has questions, feel free to raise your hand or put them in the chat. That was really fantastic, Zoe. Thank you so much. Any immediate questions? Okay, I have one for you, Zoe. So this came up when you were talking about Eichmann. I'm curious about your thoughts on law as a measure of security, or the fantasy of law being an effective or workable form of security when it has proved to be, in some cases, the very opposite. So, you know, there's this very kind of widely broadcasted appeal to The Hague by South Africa, but then also at the very beginning of the war, Israel sort of defended its violence vis-a-vis the you know, terrorism of Hamas by saying that it was following international humanitarian laws around warning before airstrikes and that sort of, that they were actually like, that it was licit violence, right? But then I was thinking, when you were talking about Eichmann, about how he was like famously sort of had no remorse and no apparent like hatred, that he was just like, I was following the law. And so I guess I'm just curious, like, because it feels like there's something psychologically complicated in people's attachment of what it means to be following the law, or the sort of morality principle of the law. And there's a strange inheritance in the case of Israel when you think about the Eichmann trial being staged there, and this kind of theatrical event of someone showing no remorse whatsoever and just saying like, I did as I was told, and then Israel doing very much the same with the IDF and its citizens and its sort of position on the world stage, sort of that it's clearly separating ethics from the from the juridical or even the kind of fantasy of there being some moral principle in law, but that's also like what I don't know. There's just a disconnect that I can't totally put my finger on. But I'm curious if you have any thoughts about law.
I mean, I will preface this by just being like, I'm an anarchist first and foremost. So mostly
I'm like going. I'm following you. Yeah.
But I have a tremendous amount of ambivalence about the law, and I'm very much a subscriber of like unjust laws called to be broken kind of relation to the law. But I feel like one of the things in thinking about Eichmann and the kind of theater around it is that we took the wrong lessons from this idea of the banality of evil. What we learned was not that everyone has the potential to become a kind of soulless bureaucrat of a genocidal machine. But what we took actually was that there was something that was particular about the propaganda bureaucratic machine of the Nazis that produced the soulless machine of Eichmann. And so the disconnect, I think, is that there is no Israeli, because of the way that Israel tethered Holocaust victimhood to a kind of new national identity, there is no universe in which any Israeli was supposed to understand that they too could become Eichmann. They were to rather understand that Eichmann, as a Nazi, as this soulless bureaucrat, was the antithesis of a proper regime of law and order. But then, of course, we know that what constitutes order is almost always undemocratic. That order is about a kind of eugenic, exclusionary production of some threat. That permanent security that all Westphalian states are participating, it's constantly in service of the elimination or mediation of the threat posed to internal or external security by some threat. And so in the Israeli case, from the very beginning, what constituted Israeli law and order was always the negation of Palestinian life. And so for the Israelis to say we were following the law, you are following a legal order that is always already annihilatory. So yes, I'm sure you were following the law. I'm sure you're doing exactly what you have been told that you are allowed to do as a soldier, if your entire structure of law and order is predicated upon a kind of debasing, dehumanization, disenfranchisement, etc., of Palestinians. And so then to me, there doesn't feel like there's a sense then also that, you know, Israel can exist also above international law, because international law and the definition of genocide itself was supposed to coalesce around the exceptionalism of the Nazi Holocaust. And so then by siding with the new Nazis, the Palestinians, and by undermining the descendants of the victims of the kind of archetypal genocide that is the genesis of the very definition of genocide, there is no international legal order that is allowed to do that. And so in this particular way, Israel holds itself as being above the law because the law has constructed Israel, or has constructed Jewish suffering as being the kind of preeminent um, vulnerable subject or vulnerable genocidal or victim of genocide. And so the structure of international law has brought us to now this tension. And this is why, you know, genocide studies is falling apart right now, because the fact that the nucleus of the discipline is still around the Nazi Holocaust, people have no idea how to contend with this question of what does it mean for a Jewish state to engage in a genocide, particularly in justification of the genocide that led to the creation of the Jewish state. Like, this becomes this real circularity that people simply don't want to have to attend to. And so this question of legal order, you know, also exists at an impasse, because it's like, okay, say you want to change the legal order in some way, you want to change the composition of the Security Council, change the composition of the United Nations, that has to go through the Security Council, which on it, you know, inherent in the Security Council, like, is the power of the Eurocentric legal order. So we're just kind of caught in all of these kind of nasty webs of how the law works, I think.
Right.
I think it has its kind of potentials and uses in some ways, but then also you said that Israel is plausibly committing genocide in a court that has no means of enforcement because it does not want to be a super sovereign international organization.
Right.
What is the point of the law? Like, the law has proved itself to be kind of useless in a way.
Right. Right. Yeah. There are some questions in the chat, and also some hands raised. Jim, do you want to read yours aloud, or is it okay if I read it? I'll go ahead, unless you turn on your mic. There's a deep parallel between the development of Israeli/Zionist state politics and its relationship to the Holocaust and the needs of neo-colonial, especially American geopolitical intervention in the Middle East. The conflict between the US and the Soviet Union had the USSR supporting and then arguably abandoning the Arab nations, while the US fully backed Israel as one of its two critical pillars of its neo-colonial project of interest. With the collapse of the USSR and its backing of Arab nations, how do you see the interaction of these threads of Zionist political development with imperialist and especially America intervention?
So the kind of Zionist statecraft has been kind of interesting. So at the very beginning, you know, the Israeli state was, you know, voting either neutrally or against South African apartheid. But then after the 67 war and the kind of attack on kind of oil producing and Arab states, much of the so-called, you know, third world global South kind of turned against Israel, and, you know, Israel became a real pariah. And both as a result, I think, of its pariahness, but also because of the support for Zionism that, you know, began with Jan Smuts in South Africa. There was a kind of deep affection and deep relationship between Israel and apartheid South Africa, which through the import and the purchase of arms basically helped Israel survive the 70s and 80s. And so I think that there's a really deep intimacy between Zionism and imperiality, not only because of the way that the creation and the partition and the settlement of Israel proceeded through settler colonial means. You have Israel that is, you know, intimately related to the other states in the settler international, which you have the United States, Canada, Australia, then Rhodesia, South Africa, New Zealand, and did I already say the United Kingdom? And the United Kingdom, you know, there was first during the Cold War, you know, a synonymity between Zionism and anti-communism, with the Israeli state basically arming every liberation, the opposite side of basically every liberation struggle around the world, supporting Pinochet in Israel, supporting the Rhodesians, supporting apartheid, um, uh, South Africa, on the being, arming, India against Kashmir. And so I understand basically always, both through the kind of mandate of the Genesis and also this sense of this sense of victimhood, inherent in permanent security, in this question of how do we create a world that is safe for Jews, but ultimately is creating a world. There's this, let me back that up. There's this collapsing of what it means to create a world that's safe for Jews that only understands how to create a world that is safe for the economic and military interests of the Israeli state, because that is understood as the center of the Jewish world. Because again, Zionism is predicated upon the negation of the diaspora, and this conception of the fact that supporting and being supported by fascist and right-wing authoritarian states around the world makes it more and more impossible for diasporic Jews to be able to live a life safely in their respective locations. So it almost feels as though there's this this almost like a deliberate willingness to destabilize, because the more unstable Jewish diasporic existence is and becomes, the more attractive and the more justified Israeli Zionist fortressing and statecraft becomes. So I'm kind of in two places, in the sense that there is this like almost there's a kind of like anti-Semitic death drive of Zionism, in the sense that Israel wants to sustain itself but can only do so in making Jewish diasporans more precarious. But that's kind of a new consideration. But I don't think I that's hardly a new one. I don't think I'm the first person to try to think through that.
So maybe we'll just take Emily's question and then return to the chat.
This is a really wonderful conversation. Thank you. I wondered if you could, I've been thinking about a set of terms, like, I've been thinking about universalism, like the call to universalism, or the problem of like partial universalization, or wrong universalizing, or a refusal of the universal, in relation to like other ideas like historicity, particularity, specificity, comparison. Like, I really appreciated how you began talking about like drawing the triangle of like who are the parties involved, and then also talking about the problem of the continuity thesis, and like the way that like what becomes exemplary of what else, and what happens, like what are the pitfalls of comparison. And I was wondering, like, I think you see all the time this like sort of universalizing a historicity in the move that the Israeli state makes of comparing all sorts of parties to Nazis, and this sort of like atemporal, total, always anti-Semitic force of the world, that can be slotted in and out, but then an absolute exception for Jews as victims of a kind of incomparable horror, and a refusal to universalize the victim position. And I was interested in particular in Amery has this like insistence at the end of the essay about a fear that like the Holocaust will be sort of generalized into the barbarism of the 20th century. So it will be like, well, it's sort of like the Armenians, it's like the colonial French, all nations do this, it's horrible. But I think I understood him to be saying something different than a kind of exceptionalism. And maybe this is just because I've like felt a lot of sympathy with the discussion of resentment, and so there's something that I want to recuperate about that. But but I wondered if you agreed, and if there's a sense in which it seemed to me that he was making a call for not exceptionalism, but specificity, and a refusal to allow comparison to sort of dilute the question of specific lineages of responsibility. So I don't know, I wondered if you could maybe, I feel like you have like so much clarity on that sort of constellation of abstracting moves. And I wondered if you could talk about them a little bit.
Yeah. I think I agree with your reading. Because I'm also deeply sympathetic to these notions of resentment. I mean, I'm a Scorpio, so if I have resentment, I have nothing. But the kind of question of universality and comparison is something that feels troubled for me as someone who works in genocide studies. And whenever we're thinking about, well, what is a genocide, we're always forced to go back to the UN's definition of genocide, which is comprised of 5 characteristics. But there are other genocides that don't contain those characteristics. So on one hand, there's a kind of universality, and I think maybe this is a law problem again, but there's a kind of universality that we deploy in our attempt to standardize a crime. Okay, let me back this up. So the thing that's really the most unhelpful part about genocide is the fact that it's a crime. Because what crime does, or what crime has done in this context of law, is that it creates like boundaries on behavior and the capacity or the capaciousness of memory and of time. So in order for something to be understood as a crime, we have to understand it beginning on this date and ending on this date. So there are also these historical consensuses that bolster a particular accusation of criminality. There are all of these pieces of evidences that bolster a claim of something being really genocide or not really being genocide. And I think that that's deeply problematic, right? Like you have the Ova Herrero and the Nama, and historians are like, it began in 1904 and ended in 1908. Whereas that community is like, well, actually, because there are so many of our ancestors whose remains are in museums and you are not dead until you're interred, we understand the genocide is still ongoing. So there are all of these really kind of community particular ways that this universality of genocide as a crime is undermined, and I think undermined productively. I have so that said, I have kind of a difficult time with a kind of, I don't think that this is what you were doing, a kind of binary of like a universal against a comparative, or like I deeply believe in particularism. Like I think that the Holocaust is unique, but not exceptional, because I think that every genocidal process has to be assessed like through the kind of contingency of the material conditions that led to these particular kinds of violence. However, I think that there are some kind of like universalizable ideas and characteristics that, you know, for example, are crudely summarized in the 10 stages of genocide, that you can follow, because genocide always follows in these kind of 10 linear frames, which it absolutely doesn't.
What? Yeah, I don't know why it won't connect to.
Zoe, let me get it for you.
I think that you were really apt in your description of this kind of atemporal, always already, always anti-Semitism that exists, which is deeply ahistorical. And I think I'm also not reading his particularity as an exceptionalism. I think he's just like, I was deeply traumatized by this thing. We were deeply traumatized by this thing, and it's going to take some time for us to not hold on to this anymore. And I think that should be a universal position, actually. This idea that there is a kind of moral value and historical validity to the structuring of resentment. But his question, I think the question that plagues us is this question of still how much longer. And that is the kind of maybe the violence of historicity and the violence of the ethnomathematical ordering of violence through numbers, through the dates, through the distance from beginning, through the registering of the 6 million Jews, the 11 million victims. But I think I don't really have a good answer, because I feel like the answer to the question that you are kind of posing is kind of the question that my work is about, and that we're kind of trying to sift through and think about what is victimhood, how do we articulate and communicate victimhood, and how do these victimhoods interact with other victimhoods. And I think that that's ultimately the question of Israel. I think one of the things that Benbassa writes really usefully is thinking about like the Nakba as catastrophe and the Shoah as calamity, right? And these two like epochal violences against a people, but one of them justifying the other. And I don't know. I think that this is really a disciplinary violence that is ongoing in genocide studies, in the way that memory has been captured around the Shoah. I'm sorry, I don't have something less ambivalent than that, but I really don't know.
I'm gonna read one from the chat. Thanks, Zoe. This is really helpful. I really appreciate it. Okay, from Catherine Krim. I was so interested in Amery's work of articulating the problem with natural, quotes, natural historical progress / temporality, where, quote, time heals all wounds. But I'm wondering how to understand the alternative he's working toward via resentment. At moments, it sounds almost Christological. On the field of history, this is a quote, on the field of history, there would occur what I hypothetically described earlier for the limited individual circle, two groups of people, the overpowered and those who overpowered them would be joined in the desire that time be turned back, and with it, that history become moral. Would you be able to elaborate on how you see an opening here for a different historical understanding, if there is one?
I think the Christological reading, I think, is really apt and really important, especially in thinking about how so much of the memory of the Holocaust has become theological. Even all of the secular readings are still theological, and how much the kind of like the story of Jewishness, especially as a state story, is about atonement, a kind of resurrection, which are, articulated in kind of Judaism in particular ways, but which are like deeply, deeply, deeply Christian ideas, especially when you think about like how Christian Zionism is much, 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 much older than Jewish Zionism. I don't have a different historical understanding other than the kind of previous ambivalence around time, and this idea that like time is fake. This insistence on a particular kind of linearity as forward progress is fake. I mean, I think I just did a talk where I was talking about like history, much more depressingly, is fractal, that there's a kind of self-sameness in all of these violences, which are kind of constantly being re-enfleshed. And I think maybe understanding a fractality versus a linearity is a useful way of understanding this problem of historical interpretation. And also the idea that violence helps people become more moral, because I think that, you know, this is one of the useful critiques of Fanon in the engagements of revolutionary violence, is that actually, unfortunately, like once you stop, it's really, 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 or once you start, it's very hard to stop. And I think that revolutionary violence, there's a kind of different moral arrangement within it, but he is operating within a moral arrangement in which violence is value neutral. Like violence is simply a tool. Genocide is simply a tool. And so it's almost about a kind of engagement of the moral with the not amoral, but the not moral, the moral with the functional, the moral with, this is going to sound really crass, but the utilitarian. And I think that there are kind of maybe different discursive registers that have to be brought together, rather than a moral alignment that is able to become more congruous with time, if that made sense. But I also tend not to think in the moral at all when it comes to violence. Like I'm not especially compelled by the question of evil. So I might be the wrong person to ask about time and morality.
Any other questions that anyone wants to, you can just unmute and ask if you'd like. I'm curious, Zoe, I mean, this is maybe too expansive a prompt, but I'm wondering about contemporary Germany, and I guess I mean there's so many places to locate like an analysis, but I keep thinking about this claim in Germany that anti-Semitism is not endemic to Germany, that it comes in with like, you know, Muslims and Arabs and guest workers, which like replaced the German population after World War. I don't know. There's just this strange discourse of and also, you know, obviously very active neo-Nazi groups still sprinkled around Germany. So I don't know. I guess I was thinking about the point you made earlier about Palestinians becoming the substitution for the Nazis, and the way that this is operating in the German state today. So I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I think about this every day. I think this idea of Palestinians and Arabs more generally becoming the new Nazis is as important a concept for Zionist state crafting as it is for Germany, because it becomes a way for Germany to be allowed to abdicate its responsibility for fighting anti-Semitism, which is a European problem, and instead commit itself to fighting Nazism. Because what the German sin is Nazism, not anti-Semitism. And so I think that's the kind of productive meeting point of the kind of post-war responsibility for Jews and the post-war or whatever engagement of foreigners. So if we think about the anti-Semitism problem in Germany, in post-war Germany, as beginning with the arrival of Turks and then Arabs and others, then you're able to kill two birds with one stone. And this isn't even me imagining it. there was literally an interview with the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz in like October, where he was like, we need to decrease immigration from Arab states to Germany because Arab states are anti-Israel. Not
Exactly. I mean,
anti-Semitic,
it's like, right. It's
are
like an interest
anti-Israel.
convergence thing where that becomes
Yeah.
a way to say we can't keep up with, yeah, right.
Absolutely. So in this kind of creation of an anti-Nazi German citizenry, you have, in addition to this you know, one, this desire to decrease immigration from Muslim Arab states, because this is the means of importing Nazism, and also, of course, dovetails into the ongoing so-called migrant crisis in Europe. And then you also have the disciplining of German Jews as good anti-Nazi German citizens. And to be anti-Nazi as a German citizen is to necessarily be anti-Palestinian or anti-Arab. So that's at least how I'm understanding this new imported anti-Semitism thing, you know, in Germany.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yasmin.
Thank you so much for the readings and for this discussion. I was really, the Amery reading, so much of it has been just, I think is going to stick in my mind for a long time, but particularly this point about his discussion of morality and moral truth. I almost read it in some parts as, it sort of seemed to me like he was using morality almost as a stand-in for recognition in some ways. Like he talks about the violence of his oppressor, you know, through the shovel or whatever it is, as being empty of morality. It's devoid of morality. And then it's as if he wants to kind of infuse it with morality or with moral attachment in some act of, you know, this impossible act of going back in time, right? Mm-hmm. And I really tie that to the passages where he talks about, you know, the blank faces of Germans who are seeing him suffer or seeing the piles of corpses. And yeah, like a kind of a desire to bring morality back into the picture as a way of also demanding or even reaching for recognition, either in the moment that is past or the present now that has moved on. And I couldn't help also but like, it resonated with me in this moment with what's happening in Gaza in terms of the difficulty and the frustration and the pain that so many people are having in, like, almost in spite of themselves, engaging in some kind of politics of appeal to a completely indifferent world structure, media, whatever, fill in the blank, right? So this feeling of like, how much suffering do we have to live stream? How many photos? How many corpses? How, you know, and again, that it's trying to kind of infuse morality into a conversation or a dynamic that is indifferent to it, but actually really it's also this question of recognition. And we hear Palestinians say this all the time, right? When will you see us as human beings? When do we have a right to exist? So I don't know, this may be a bit of a reach in the reading, but I just wondered if
I don't think that that's a reach at all. I think that that's very, 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 very much how I read it as well. And I think that for me felt particularly, there was the part where literally the part where he talks about, like, at the bottom of 70, that only when he's standing in front of the firing squad is he going to be able to experience that moral truth of victimhood when he is being faced with the consequence. So I think this distinction between kind of moral affirmation and recognition is really important, because only can the moral truth be shared in a moment of consequence. Which is to say, there's not an appeal that's possible. And this is the kind of trouble with the resentment, where he's like, there has to be something between some kind of punishment that is proportionate to the volume of suffering, which of course is impossible if we're thinking about this as a kind of an eye for an eye thing, or atonement. And these are kind of the only modes of recognition that we understand in this kind of regime of morality. There's forgiveness, or the kind of punitive legal apparatus that is able to sufficiently punish those who do wrong. And I feel like that's why we understand a kind of appeal to the ICJ, because as much as Palestinians, as much as, other, colonized, marginalized communities understand that the law is useless, but what other kind of normative modes of recognition, because morality in itself cannot be appealed to. So all you have are these kind of like normative material structures that compel that are kind of punitive, but that compel a kind of recognition, compel a kind of action, or a kind of action or cease of violence or whatever, because there isn't Palestinians are like trapped in this like really, really difficult position, a similar position that of course that like Black Americans find themselves in, and being like, do we share these images of Black people being killed by cops or do we not? It's a very different position in Gaza, because there are no other people that are there to also be witnesses and share these images of suffering, so that we might all be moral arbiters, right? Like, it is the people who are being oppressed themselves that are forced to be like, this is what's happening. And so it feels like it's an appeal to it's the use of the photograph as a kind of evidentiary mode, which is troubled, of course, by the absence of an objective viewer. There's a collapse of the kind of objective photographer and the subject that then kind of gets muddied. And the difficulty in that is that we know that the regime, the moral kind of economy and regime of the image, both reifies the other and allegedly brings us into a kind of moral closeness. And I think that undermining this kind of question of moral truth is the problem of the human, right? If we're going to think about it in Sylvia Wintarian terms, that the category of the human is something that most of the world has no access to, or has limited or conditional access to, because to be human and capital H man is to exist within this imperial regime of personhood that Palestinians will never exist in, that Black people will never exist in, that the world's indigenous will never exist in. And so I read this kind of appeal of time as a kind of not nihilistic, not pessimistic, but like as a kind of hope, but a not so optimistic hope, but as an idea of like, there has to be something that can alleviate this, and I don't know what it is. And so it has to be time. But yeah, I don't know. Again, I don't really have a better answer than that, because I'm stuck in the same kind of moral, affective, whatever position that, you seem to be stuck in, that we're all stuck in and have been stuck in for some time. It almost feels like what is sufficient to prevent the violence from happening again is almost what the question feels like. And if we had an answer to that, we would not be here to some extent, I don't know. But I think your reading of that as the moral truth as a recognition, I think that's exactly how I read it, I think.
reminds me a bit of the anxiety that Chelsea Manning expressed in the chat logs about whether the information once leaked, whether these cables, this footage of airstrikes would actually affect anything. There's like this strong desire that there would be a transformation set off by the availability of these images and this information, and also a real anxiety about that not being that not pushing the needle.
This is the myth or the conceit of photography, the kind of insistence that, you know, following Susan Sontag, we have to look. To look is to make us more human, which is to compel us to action. But I think that Berger was right in, you know, writing about images of, you know, of agony, is that we're rendered inert. We are rendered inert and unable to assimilate what we have seen into our life. And this is in part because of the nature of the photograph. I mean, I came of age, kind of teenagehood during the Bush years. And I remember watching or seeing the images from Abu Ghraib on television and having no idea what I was looking at. And even my father having no idea what he was looking at. And, you know, when I kind of came to understand what it was, I was like, okay, this has to be the thing. Like, this has to be what does it. And what, 2 people went to jail? Like they threw a woman in jail and like some other person, and that was kind of it. And that, I don't know, that to me feels like the beginning of some sense of realization that seeing doesn't necessarily do anything, because I think shortly after that was the Israel's war with Lebanon. And I remember like him explaining to me Zionism, and I was like, okay, so then all we need to do is like get the word out about Palestine, because it just seems like people don't know what Palestine is, and this is and he was just like, I've got something to tell you about this. And I was like, huh. We like read Jimmy Carter's Peace Not Apartheid, and I was like, this has been going on for over 70 years, and just, you know, so we've come to this moment because we can see too much, because of the way that we see as like kind of reconstituting all of these kind of temporal modes and forms and whatever. Seeing is not enough. And so this comes back again to his question, what is?
Right.
Yeah, sorry to be a downer.
No. Any other questions? I think that's a really productive place to leave it, actually. And it's helpful to be brought into your thinking on this rather than presented with, you know, a sort of like resolute position on what I mean, it's of course none of us can expect that, but it's been really helpful to explore these texts together. And yeah, if anyone does want to follow up with questions, I'm sure Zoe would receive them. But thank you thank you so much for your time and for your responses. And we will be meeting next week with, what are the
Next week we'll be reading Toscaeus and Joanna Masso on Toscaeus, and a piece by Frantz Fanon, and Perwana Nazif will come to speak with us about it. We'll be moving to our final section that tries to braid the psychical and the social, and we'll start with the sort of birth of institutional psychoanalysis and Toscaeus next week.
Thank you all so much for coming. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zoe. Thank you so much.